All right, let's get right into it. When you think of Spain, you probably picture a modern, vibrant European country, right? But if you scratch just a little bit below that surface, you find a deep and, frankly, dark history that explains so many of its problems today. We're going to pull back the curtain on the historical roots of corruption in Spain. The blueprint for this kind of state-sponsored theft was apparently drawn up 400 years earlier. At the heart of this historical precedent is a guy called the Duke of Lerma, who was the chief minister to King Philip III. Now, he wasn't just any politician. You can think of him as the architect of a scheme that would set a really dark precedent for centuries to come. And here is his scheme. And you gotta admit, it's both brilliant and deeply corrupt. You use your insider knowledge to secretly buy up cheap land. Then, you use the full power of the state to make that land incredibly valuable. Then, you cash out. This wasn't just a one-off crime. This became the template for using public office for private gain that would just echo through Spanish history. Let's start with this number, 90 billion euros. That's a number so big, it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around it. But according to official estimates, that is the insane amount that corruption costs Spain every single year. It's like a massive wound that just keeps bleeding the country's economy dry. So what does 90 billion euros really feel like? Well, the best way to think about it is as a hidden tax. It's this invisible burden that's placed on every single citizen, sucking money away from things we all need. Hospitals, schools, roads. It is a price that everyone in the country is forced to pay, whether they realize it or not. When you see a number that big, when you see corruption so systemic that impunity feels like the rule, not the exception, it forces you to ask a really uncomfortable question. Is Spain really the modern European nation it appears to be? Or is it something else? To answer that, we have to look back. Way back. Okay, so our journey starts back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. We're talking about a system of control that's, it's uniquely Spanish. It's called caciquismo. And believe me, this is where the blueprint, the original design for today's corruption, was first sketched out. Now, this wasn't just, a bit of simple bribery here and there. Oh no, caciquismo was a whole system. Think of it like a feudal-style mafia, where these local warlords, they were called caciques, they literally treated the government, the state itself, like it was their own private property. And it was all structured very neatly, like a pyramid of power. So at the bottom, you've got your local cacique. He has absolute control over his town or city. Then you go up a level, you've got a provincial kingpin, who's basically coordinating all those local bosses. And right at the tippy top, the entire state, the whole government apparatus, was just there to serve this private network. And when I say their power was absolute, I mean it. A cacique could handpick the mayor, bribe a judge, rig an election. He could literally decide which local businesses would thrive and which would just disappear. He was the law, the economy, and the government all rolled into one person. And this quote right here, it just hits the nail on the head. Power was not a public trust, but a private asset to be exploited. I mean, think about that. The whole idea of public service, it just didn't exist. Power was a tool, a resource, something you used to make yourself rich. It wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system. So the most damaging thing this left behind wasn't just the stolen cash, it was the culture. A deep-rooted, really resilient culture of impunity, where powerful people genuinely believed that they were completely, totally above the law, and that they always would be. So what happens when a system like that gets challenged? Does it reform? Nope. It gets violent. And that brings us to our next chapter, an era known as pistolerismo. See, in the early 20th century, you've got these labor movements starting to rise up, people demanding basic rights, better pay. And of course, this was a huge threat to the profits of the rich industrialists who were loving the old system. And their response? It was absolutely brutal. Now, the history books, the official story, might call this political conflict. But let's be real, the reality was so much darker. What this really was, in essence, was corporate-sponsored terrorism. And here's the playbook. You've got these powerful industrialists, the factory owners. They're not going to negotiate. Instead, they just hire assassins, hired guns. And their targets? The labor leaders, the union organizers. The goal was simple and, frankly, terrifying. If someone threatens your profits, you eliminate them with a bullet. This whole period was a really dark turning point. It basically forged this unholy alliance between big business and criminality. It set a precedent, a terrible one, that if you had enough money, you could use violence to protect it, and you'd face zero consequences. Now, you might think that a brutal dictatorship would just wipe the slate clean, start over. But under Francisco Franco, that foundation of impunity wasn't torn down. Oh no. It was industrialized. It was put on steroids and made an official part of the state. The Franco regime, for all intents and purposes, operated as one giant organized crime syndicate. We're not talking about a few rogue officials lining their pockets here. The entire government was basically a machine designed to make the regime's friends rich and to crush its enemies. It took the warlords' blueprint and perfected it. Well, the whole uprising was framed as this urgent action against some very specific threats. Franco's coup was built on these supposed conspiracies by communists and Freemasons. You've got the aristocracy, the major landowners with their huge estates, the top industrialists, and, this is critical, the Catholic Church. Together, these groups were the absolute pillars of the old order, and they were fighting tooth and nail to protect their privileges. This really gets to the heart of it. Publicly, the enemy they sold to everyone was communism. But according to this analysis, the real threat was something else entirely. It was progress. More specifically, it was the terrifying idea of secular education, which threatened to break their total control over the minds of the Spanish people. The main target of their fear was this movement called the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, or ILE. Its goal was pretty simple: to modernize Spain and to pull it out of its status as the most illiterate nation in Europe. Well, for the church, this was a nightmare. Their social control depended on having a monopoly over education, a monopoly that kept people in a kind of medieval ignorance. Now, the church was a huge player here, terrified of losing its power in a new secular republic. And it operated through this incredibly sophisticated propaganda machine, a Jesuit-led group that was basically its intellectual arm. They were masters at manipulating public opinion, and behind the scenes were pulling the strings of major political parties. Just look at this chain of events from 1932. The Second Republic comes along and proposes a pretty modest land reform. Basically, hey, let's take some of the unused land from these massive estates and give it to starving peasants. Simple enough, right? Well, that reform gets blocked at every turn by political games. But here's the crazy part. Just the idea of it, the mere suggestion, was enough for the elites to try and launch a full-on military coup. Think about what that means. The violent reaction wasn't because some revolution was already happening. Not at all. It was a preemptive strike against even the tiniest threat of change. This wasn't a defense of some grand ideology. It was a defense of their ability to keep hoarding the country's wealth for themselves. So the motive is protecting wealth, and the enemy is progress. Got it. But how did this coalition of elites actually build the weapon they needed to carry out their plan? Spanish fascism wasn't some organic, grassroots movement. It was a manufactured tool. Step 1. You find a tiny, electorally irrelevant fringe party, in this case, the Falange. Step 2. You brand it. Slap a respectable, aristocratic leader on the front to make it look legitimate. Step 3. You fund it. You pump it full of elite cash to make it seem way more influential than it actually is. And right on cue, in steps Francisco Franco. He's portrayed here not as some ideological genius, but as a guy with a predatory instinct for power, who just wasn't very charismatic. He didn't create the movement. He just picked up the weapon the elites had already built and used it to serve their interests. So the system was in place, but how did this whole criminal enterprise actually work day to day? The corruption was just everywhere. It wasn't a part of the system, it was the whole system. We're talking about everything from securing cushy public contracts for your friends to massive, high-level international bribery. Okay, case in point, Franco's wife, Carmen Polo, she actually earned the nickname La Collares, the necklace, and her system was just so brazen. She would literally walk into a jewelry store, point at a piece she wanted, and the owner, terrified, just knew that it was now a gift for her. This wasn't a one-time thing, it was her routine. It makes the whole idea of corruption feel incredibly personal and, well, chilling. And, oh yeah, it was absolutely a family affair. Franco's own sister, Pilar, she had her own specialty: illegally grabbing properties, lands, houses that were conveniently declared to have no heirs. A little legal fiction cooked up by loyal officials, of course. The scale of this corruption was huge. It even went international. I mean, declassified British documents show that the UK paid massive bribes directly to Franco's entire high command, including his own brother Nicolas. And what were they buying? Spain's neutrality in World War II. It just goes to show, the entire regime was basically for sale to the highest bidder. And the thing is, the plunder never actually stopped. It just evolved. It got more sophisticated. Later on in the regime, these technocrats from the kind of secretive group Opus Dei took over the economy. So the crude gift-taking from the early days, that turned into complex, massive financial fraud, like the huge Matessa scandal, where they used fake exports to just siphon off tons of public money. So you can imagine how the economy worked. It was completely rewired. It wasn't about what you knew. It was who you knew. Getting a public contract was all about having the right contacts. But it gets much, much darker than that. A huge part of the profit machine was built on the backs of political prisoners, essentially slave labor. And we're not talking about a small, hidden operation. This was systemic. The fortunes of some of Spain's biggest corporations today were directly built on this slave labor. You might recognize some of these names. Companies that today are known as OHL, Ferrovial, even ACS, which is run by the president of the Real Madrid Football Club, Florentino Perez. Their foundations were built on the suffering of Republican prisoners. And this, right here, is really the core idea of what we're talking about today. Those historical structures of impunity, they never vanished. They just evolved. The warlords and the assassins didn't disappear, they just put on a suit and tie, adapting their old tricks for a new, more sophisticated age. You can literally trace the evolution. In the 19th century, it was the warlord, using raw coercion. Then in the 20th century, it's the assassin, protecting that power with violence. And today? Well, today it's the white-collar criminal, using slick financial schemes and political connections. The goal hasn't changed one bit, only the weapon is different. The fact that fascism was never truly purged has created a modern culture of impunity in Spain. And it's something that supposedly touches almost every level of society. Back in 2014, Spain's GDP magically jumped by 26 billion euros almost overnight. How? Because new European rules meant they had to start including revenue from illegal activities. We're talking drug trafficking, prostitution, the whole shebang. They literally laundered criminal money into the official national economy, making it all seem normal. Okay, so when you have this much dirty money flowing through the system, so much that it's actually being counted in the official GDP, you have to ask the obvious question, right? Who's running this show? Who's really getting rich here? Well, listen to this quote from Roberto Saviano, the Italian journalist who wrote Gomorrah and has had to live under police protection for years for exposing the mafia. He says Spain isn't just a pit stop, it is the primary headquarters for the Italian syndicates that run the entire European cocaine trade. The country has basically become a safe haven for them. So, how is that even possible? According to Saviano, it's all down to a kind of unwritten pact. The idea is that police, judges, politicians, and even bankers all sort of look the other way, allowing these massive international mafias to set up shop in Spain, as long as they follow one simple rule. Don't get violent in public. Don't commit murders that would mess with that peaceful image we saw earlier. It's a system built on quiet complicity. Okay, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like something out of a movie, maybe a wild conspiracy theory. But there's a pretty famous case from back in the day that seems to show this exact system of, looking the other way in action. Yeah, to really get this, we've got to rewind to 1990. The whole thing is called the Nasiro case. And it's this one moment that accidentally just ripped the curtain back and showed how politics, dirty money, and crime were all tangled up in Spain. All right, so here's the story. The police are investigating a drug trafficking ring. Standard stuff. But on their wiretaps, they stumble onto something way bigger, an illegal financing scheme deep inside Spain's popular party. They actually catch a party official on tape saying something that's, well, it's a smoking gun. So what happens? Case closed, right? Nope. The Supreme Court gets involved. They rule the recordings can't be used on a technicality. And then, get this, they order all the evidence to be destroyed. Poof, the scandal disappears. The party looks clean, and guess what? They go on to win power. And this is what they caught him saying on that tape. I'm in politics to get rich. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's about as blunt as you can possibly get.
This one quote from Vicente Sanz just laid the whole rotten system bare. But because the system protects its own, this bombshell of an admission was just buried, and nobody faced any real consequences.
But this culture of looking the other way, it goes so much deeper than just money, and honestly, it gets a lot more sinister.
Beyond shielding organized crime, there's a whole second layer of impunity, one that protects powerful institutions and people who commit crimes for ideological reasons. During the trial for the 1977 Atocha massacre, where communist lawyers were murdered, the fascist killers openly mocked their victims in the courtroom. Decades later, during a trial for the murder of a Basque football fan, neo-Nazis were threatening the victim's family inside the courthouse. It's like they feel completely untouchable.
So why? Why does this keep happening? 440,000. That's not a journalist's estimate. That is the Spanish government's own official estimate for the number of victims of clerical abuse in the country. It's an absolutely devastating figure. And yet, despite thousands of documented cases, it has led to almost zero legal accountability.
And instead of justice, what you see is this clear, deliberate pattern of obstruction. A newspaper investigation uncovers thousands of cases. So the church hires a law firm, run by a member of the ultra-conservative group Opus Dei, to do its own internal audit. Then another Opus Dei member actually admits to completely inventing a fake abuse story just to try and discredit the journalists who were telling the real one.
And this pattern goes way beyond the church. Look at politics. The whistleblowers who exposed huge corruption scandals in Spain's Conservative People's Party, they weren't treated like heroes. No, they were harassed for years. Their careers were destroyed. The message it sends couldn't be clearer. It is much, much safer to be corrupt than to expose corruption.
And this culture of total impunity probably reached its absolute peak in Marbella with the famous Malaya case. This was a local corruption scandal that saw 3 billion euros of public money just vanish. That is a world record for municipal corruption. A world record.
Okay, so this system, it seems kind of stable, right? But it's all built on a code of silence. It only works if everyone agrees to just look the other way. So what happens when someone refuses? What's the price for actually speaking out? Well, let's get into a specific case, and it is a chilling one. It shows you exactly how this pact is enforced. And we're not talking about fines or lawsuits here. We're talking about savage, brutal violence. Let's talk about a journalist named Chima Gil. So Chima Gil was just doing his job, the job of a journalist. He was investigating corruption in his local government down in Murcia. And for that, he wasn't just criticized. He and his entire family were thrown into an absolute nightmare. A relentless campaign of terror, complete with constant, very credible death threats. And these were not empty threats, not at all. The whole thing escalated to this, just horrific physical assault. An attacker wielding an iron bar, smashing into his car, while his wife and his young daughter were sitting right there with him. I mean, can you imagine? This is the system sending a crystal clear message. This isn't some victimless white-collar crime. It's protected by pure brute force. This attack on Gil was so awful, so blatant, that it just couldn't be swept under the rug. It brought international shame, landing Spain on reports from Reporters Without Borders. Now, that's a list you expect to see failing states on, not a modern European democracy. It just goes to show the real-world consequences this system of impunity has on a global stage.
A perfect and frankly jaw-dropping example is the Gürtel scandal. This thing was a gigantic kickbacks for contracts scheme that went all the way to the highest levels of the ruling political party. And the whole thing got blown wide open by just 2 people on the inside.
And this is where it gets really telling. Look at the difference in what happened to them. The whistleblowers, Ana Garrido and Jose Luis Peñas, they faced harassment, threats, financial ruin, even prison. Meanwhile, many of the powerful people they exposed, they got off with much, much lighter punishments. The message that sends is pretty loud and clear, isn't it?
So let's just tie this all together now. What we're looking at is an unbroken cycle. The same logic of intimidation and impunity that we saw throughout history is still playing out today in the open, sometimes in the very places meant to uphold the law. You can draw a straight line from past to present. The legacy of caciquismo, it's the way manipulating state institutions, rigging public contracts, it's all become almost normalized. and the legacy of pistolerismo? That's the deep-seated belief in the halls of power that if you're important enough, you operate outside the law. This culture of cronyism and elite impunity didn't just disappear with Franco. Instead, institutions like the restored monarchy were set up to function as tools for that same conservative elite, a way to maintain the old system of favors and corruption, just in a new package.
And this timeline really puts it all into perspective. You see the chain. It starts centuries ago with this tradition of plunder. Then the Civil War is fought to defend it. Franco's regime basically perfects it. And that leads right up to today, where recent scandals, like those involving the former king, aren't seen as something new. Instead, they're seen as a rare crack in the facade, giving us a peek at a system of elite impunity that has been operating all along. The core idea is that no matter what the public face looks like, the underlying goal is exactly the same: hang on to power and keep the plunder going.
So how does something like this keep going today, especially inside a democracy? We're talking a deep, sophisticated understanding of human psychology, knowing exactly how to exploit people's fears, and, yep, there it is again, the invaluable help of the Spanish Catholic Church.
And yet, even within this incredible history, there was always this dark undercurrent of anti-Semitism. I mean, Spain's great national hero, El Cid, is celebrated in a foundational myth specifically for conning Jewish moneylenders. And get this, the chest he supposedly filled with sand, it's still displayed like a treasure in Burgos Cathedral. It's basically a monument to a celebrated act of fraud.
Think about that. A monument to a swindle, sitting in a cathedral. It was like an act of cultural self-harm, and that's a wound that would fester and haunt Spain for centuries to come.
So what was the long-term price for centuries of forced conformity and purging its own people? Stagnation. Total stagnation. While the rest of Europe is exploding with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, Spain just falls into this deep sleep. By the 20th century, the country was plagued by illiteracy, massive inequality, and was decades behind its neighbors technologically.
And when you put those two things together, a system where public institutions are just seen as tools for personal gain, and a culture where the powerful are untouchable, well, you get the perfect storm. You create the perfect environment for today's massive, colossal corruption to just flourish.
This quote really just says it all. A corrosive legacy woven into the very fabric of its institutions. This isn't about a few bad apples, you see. It's a rot that's woven right into the DNA of the system, a legacy that's been passed down from one generation to the next.
And that brings us all the way back to the beginning, back to that shocking number, 90 billion euros. It's not just a statistic in some boring report. It's the price tag. It's the modern annual cost of this long, dark history. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question, doesn't it? If a system is built on a corrupt foundation, a foundation of warlords and hired guns, can you ever truly fix it? Or is the entire structure just fundamentally broken from the start?